210 miles off the coast of Florida sits this little hook-shaped island in the Bahamas. The name was Norman's Cay. Norman's Cay is a location that has always fascinated me. Maybe because of its amazing beaches? Nah. Perhaps its crystal clear lagoon? No again. How about the fact that 80% of all the cocaine brought into the US passed through this tiny little island in a 2-year period? If you're too young to remember, forgive me, because I'm too young myself, but the 80s was a pretty wild decade. Coming out of the oil crisis recession of the 1970s, all was looking positive for the 1980s, a time of excess and consumerism. People dreamed big in the 80s, and it was definitely a period in time that would change us forever. We would also see the rise of cocaine. The drug that made you feel like you were moving 100 miles an hour standing still. Perfect for staying up all night and partying. Celebrities took it, rock stars took it, athletes, even on Wall Street. They say timing is everything, and timing couldn't be more perfect for one specific person. A man by the name of Pablo Escobar. Pablo Escobar ran the Medellin cartel from 1976 to 1993, and while at the top, supplied 80% of the cocaine smuggled into the US, and was apparently worth $25 billion by the 1990s. The logistics of smuggling drugs into the US was ever-changing and quite difficult as time passed. Enter Carlos Lehder, Pablo Escobar's drug trafficking partner and a prominent member of the Medellin cartel. Lehder revolutionized drug smuggling in the late 70s. You see, before Carlos, drug smuggling was primarily done by mules, people bringing in small quantities of drugs in their luggage or even swallowing condoms, stuffed with cocaine. But it soon didn't take long to find more effective methods of moving the powder. In the 1970s, Carlos Lehder had done some time for marijuana charges, and during his stay had found himself a new bunkmate, a man by the name of George Young. If you ever seen the movie Blow, you'll know right away who I'm referring to because he was portrayed by Johnny Depp in the film. The two men were ambitious and made big plans to form a partnership once released from prison. George had convinced Carlos that using their own planes was the way of the future. It was time to think big. And it's not like smuggling cocaine by aircraft was a new concept. The Medellin cartel had smuggled by plane before. The problem was Colombia was just far enough from the US that no private plane could make the trip without having to refuel. Customs and the DEA were well aware of this and would be ready to make busts the minute planes would land. This is where Norman's Cay comes in. Isolated in the exhumus island chain of the Bahamas, Carlos's plan essentially would be to take over the island, build a launching pad, and use it as a hub in which planes could refuel before entering the US. Planes that would be carrying millions of dollars worth of Colombian cocaine. It was literally the perfect spot to run his empire from. Norman's Cay was a pretty low-key destination. There was a small community with a marina and a small runway, and that was pretty much it. Excursions to the island were actually quite expensive, as you needed a small plane to access it. But because Norman's Cay was infested with sharks in its shallow waters, it never really established itself as a hotspot. When Lehder landed on the island in 1978, he had actually introduced himself as Joe Lehder, not Carlos, and had told the handful of residents on the island that he was a potential island developer. A very strategic approach from the usual hostile takeovers you would expect from people in this line of work, I guess. He had also purchased a beautiful beachfront estate that he called Volcano, a house that still stands today, I believe. Well, the shell of it, I guess. After settling in on the island, Carlos would soon set his plan in motion. He would begin paying the Bohemian government to turn a blind eye to his drug smuggling activities. At this time, the Bahamas had a reputation of being very corrupt. In fact, the Prime Minister was known to have visited the island several times while Carlos was there. So this was perfect for Lehder. With the Bohemian government in his back pocket, he essentially had full control over Norman's Cay and became a presence on the island. His goal now was to chase out the current residents and make the island the home of his cocaine empire. He would begin making deals with his neighbors, buying up as much property as he can, and many of the residents obliged, probably out of fear, but nevertheless, many were okay with selling their homes. You have to understand, many of the inhabitants on the island were retired individuals and weren't really looking for any trouble. Probably the reason they moved to a private island to begin with. And the ones that were reluctant to sell, well, you know. To help with this situation, Carlos would bring in a large crew of menacing Germans armed to the teeth, real paramilitary-looking personnel to start wandering the island, probably in an effort to scare them into selling. Strange things began to happen. Some residents would find their boats floating freely far away from their docks, rope lines mysteriously cut, or water in their cisterns would be tainted. Even one instance of someone's dog being found floating in their water cistern, allegedly. But the definitive moment when the residents knew the island was no longer safe was when a body was found mysteriously murdered on a yacht. Lehder would eventually be successful in paying or forcing the local population to leave. He now had full and total control of Norman's Cay. From 1978 to 1982, this island was the Caribbean's main drug smuggling hub, a hideaway and a party playground for Carlos and his associates. Construction gear would also be imported to the island to construct things like aircraft hangars and storage units. He would also expand the runway airstrip to 3,300 feet to allow all sorts of aircrafts, fully loaded with cocaine, to land safely. Planes coming in from Colombia, of course. Once on the ground, the product would be reloaded into various smaller aircrafts and then distributed to locations like Florida, Georgia, Texas, and the Carolinas. Lehder's method allowed traffickers to move unimaginable quantities, big numbers. Carlos was believed to earn between 250 to 300 million every year when the island was operating at its peak, wealth that would eventually mount into the billions. And they played just as hard too. They would routinely throw cocaine and booze-fueled parties that were that of legend. Lehder would fly in hookers by the plane loads and host these massive orgies that lasted for days on end. People would be seen wandering the island butt naked, have these huge bonfires on the beach, all while blitzed out of their minds. Carlos and his associates were living like rock stars in paradise. But like they say, all good things must come to an end. By the mid-1980s, the US finally got wise to Lehder's transport routes and also started putting some serious pressure on the Bohemian government, strong-arming them into cracking down on the drug-related activities taking place on Norman's Cay. Carlos was essentially told to leave. Between that and the pressure on the Medellin cartel at the time, Carlos Lehder's partners may have been the ones that pulled the plug on Norman's Cay. Sort of a mystery. Authorities would eventually raid the island right around this time, but Carlos would be long gone, of course, leaving Norman's Cay virtually destroyed. His house he called the Volcano was found burnt, along with other homes on the island. Bullet shells scattered all over the place, and crashed planes. This is actually one of the reasons I would love to visit Norman's Cay. There are dozens of videos on YouTube of people exploring the island and its remains, and I hope to do the same sometime soon, perhaps after this crazy pandemic. And remember how I had mentioned Lehder intimidating and pretty much forcing people to leave the island during his rise to power? Well, there was one individual by the name of Richard Novak who stayed defiant against Carlos Lehder and refused to leave. He was a marine biologist studying the waters and also the sharks around Norman's Cay. In the beginning, Carlos and Richard were actually close, but as the cocaine operations grew on the island, it was clear to Novak that something wasn't right, and with no help from the authorities, Richard E. Novak would take matters into his own hands. If you guys want to know more about this story, I would recommend reading the book Turning the Tide, One Man Against the Medellin Cartel. A great read. It's just another moment in time.